Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 301. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about trains and canyons and photography as we go to Chihuahua, Mexico.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's episode, I do have two news stories for you. The students in St. Mary's College in Maryland that ran out of dormitory space, some of them will be staying on a cruise ship. They're recycling an out-of-service coastal cruise vessel, the 301-passenger Sea Voyage. It's a great story about doing something new with something old. Speaking of something old, Ryanair scared some of their customers recently when it looked like they were repairing the windscreen in one of their aircrafts with what looked like duct tape or gaffer tape. It has a dark side, it has a light side, and it holds the universe together. For links to both those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Ralph Velasco, photographer and friend who's come to talk to us about a lesser visited portion of Mexico, or at least lesser visited by Americans. Ralph, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here again.
Now, you just did a 35-day tour of Mexico.
Right?
I say tour, not like you were on a guided tour here, but you were on assignment.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify. It was a 35-day assignment to shoot the travel and cultural images to go along with the food photography for a cookbook on the regional cuisine of Mexico.
And, the first question, of course, I have, and as well as many people have, is how do I get a job like this?
I was actually referred to it by a friend of mine who's another photographer, and he travels quite a bit himself, and so has a family as well, and couldn't get away for 35 days, which a lot of people can't. And so he suggested that they contact me, which they did, and I was available, and I'll tell you, it was the best gig ever, as you can imagine.
And the reason why we focused in today on Chihuahua, which is a state, not just a small yappy dog, is that you said to me before we started this that you found that portion of Mexico the most surprising.
Yeah, I used to live in Mexico City, and so I've traveled around Mexico quite a bit, and this was an area that I hadn't been to before. And perhaps part of the surprise was that I didn't have a whole lot of expectations for it.
Mm-hmm.
So we flew into Chihuahua City, and the city itself is rather industrial. I mean, there's some nice historical sites, beautiful church, Pancho Villa's museum is there. It was about 110 degrees, though.
Oh,
so,
my. Okay.
Yeah, we were there in August, which I think is the best time to travel to Mexico, if you ask me, especially for photography. But it can get hot. It does rain sometimes, but it makes for wonderful photography.
And let's put Chihuahua on the map for those people who don't know where it is. We're talking about a northern province of Mexico that does go all the way right up to Texas. It does contain the city that I would avoid going to right now, Ciudad Juarez, right up there on the border. But you're further south as you're talking about Chihuahua City and some of the other places we're going to talk about.
That's right. Chihuahua City, I think, is 3.5, 4 hours away from the border by car. I know Qantas Airlines is now starting direct flights, I believe, from Dallas-Fort Worth to Chihuahua. As I mentioned, it's an industrial center, the city itself, but there are some historical sites there that are well worth visiting. When we were there, the temperature was very high, so we kind of had to be careful how much we were out and about, especially during the middle of the day, which, of course, isn't the best time to be photographing anyway. But when we arrived, we were met by a couple that acted as our guide for the next 5 or 6. Actually, I think we were in Chihuahua State a total of 7 days. It was the longest time we were in any state on that 35-day assignment. And they met us at the airport, took us out to breakfast, gave us a little city tour, had lunch later in the day, and then we embarked on a 4-hour drive north to an area called Casas Grandes. And that valley that goes from Chihuahua to Casas Grandes, which is near the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Paquime, was absolutely gorgeous. And when I was looking at the weather conditions before the trip and trying to plan my packing and everything that I was going to bring with me, every city that we were going to in Mexico had 10 straight days of thunderstorms, according to weather.com. So I'm wondering, of course, why are we going in August when it looks like it's going to be raining every single day? But it was that kind of rain where maybe it rained an hour or a half hour a day. Typically it was way out in the distance, so these wonderful puffy clouds. So it made for fantastic photography.
Now, I was also in Mexico in August, but I was in the Yucatan. I am picturing I'm in a tropical climate and you're in a drier climate.
Yeah, and Chihuahua is known for its desert, the Chihuahuan Desert. Mm-hmm. However, it's my understanding that the state itself is the most forested state in Mexico of its 31 states and the Distrito Federal. So that was a surprising fact that I found.
Interesting.
So we didn't get into any of the desert part of the state, which I imagine is way north and maybe a little bit west in the state. We were about midway up and southwest.
And probably the most important question we should just deal with right away is, how long do you have to be in Chihuahua before you can say the name without giggling?
Well, the joke was, when are we going to see our first Chihuahua dog? And it took about 5 days into the trip before we saw one. Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned you went up to Casas Grandes, so we're in big houses basically at that point, and you mentioned the archaeological zone at, I'm going to let you pronounce it.
Paquime.
Paquime, okay. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about a pueblo complex.
Yeah, and I'm not very good at history like you are. And as a photographer, what's great, and I'll tell you a little bit about our trip in general, is that we were flown around like rock stars. And I think we had 11 or 12 different flights within the 35 days. We were all over the country because we were shooting and writing about, because I was with an Australian writer who is a travel writer but also does food writing. So we were all over the country, so it was very much go, go, go. And there were 10 to 14-hour days and not a lot of free time to ourselves, always traveling, airplanes, living out of suitcases. I mean, that's the bad part, quote, bad part. But we did have guides everywhere we went because the writer needed to have a history of all these wonderful places that we're going to, the food, the people, the culture. But as a photographer, unfortunately, I'm always off on my own because we've only got a limited time in a place, and he's getting all the history, and I'm just taking the pictures.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of dates and places, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, it looks like from what I have found that we're talking about an area that was inhabited roughly between the 1100s and the 1300s. So pre-Columbian, large city, part of that cliff-dwelling sort of culture that extends up into the southwest of the United States.
Right, and they were not the typical sort of stone houses or these foundations that were still there. They were more made out of adobe
Hmm.
and that type of building material. So not what I expected.
Okay. And where did you go after Pakime?
So we spent one night in Casas Grandes, and Paquime is right there. So we went out early in the morning, as we did in every site, because of course I wanted to capture the best light of the day.
Hmm.
It took some prodding to get the writer to get out early because,
The best writing is not like the best photography. It's done later in the day after drinks or something.
well, yeah, I quote Patrick Symes in my book, and he says, if you don't like getting up early, then be a writer. So, but yeah, I needed to get out there for the best light of the day, and there's so many other reasons to get out early. There's less people, there's hardly any bugs, it's cooler, and on and on. But from Casas Grandes, we went back down south to the town of Cuauhtemoc, and along the way, we drove through an area that's inhabited by the Mennonites.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, very, very interesting area. And they have just taken over this whole area of the state of Chihuahua, and they are real entrepreneurs. They've got all the vertical markets of business, from maintaining the tractors that do the fields and the seeds that plant the fields and everything in between. All the businesses for about a 50-mile stretch along that road, as far as the eye could see, were owned by the Mennonites. So we had lunch there, met one of the women, and she told us all about the history of their culture.
Hmm.
And then we made our way down to Creel, which is sort of the start of the Copper Canyon.
Hmm.
Now, the train, El Chepe train, actually goes from Chihuahua City down to Los Moches in Sinaloa State. But most of the Copper Canyon is in the state of Chihuahua.
And when I started to say that you went to a state that is less touristed, I had to correct myself because Copper Canyon is quite a tourist destination, but not as much for Americans.
Yeah, I don't think I saw one other American. And being there in August was a great time, not only because of the weather and the photo opportunities, but there were a lot less tourists.
Hmm.
It was mostly Mexican tourists. So one of the negatives was that the train was very short. So photography, and we can talk about some of my tips for shooting from a train, but having a short train makes it kind of difficult to get in the back and shoot that whole train going down the tracks.
Right. You wanted to shoot the train coming around corners and things like that.
Right.
Interesting. Can you describe the Copper Canyon for us, for those people who, especially Americans, who don't run across references to it as much? I don't think I had actually heard about it until maybe 3-4 years ago, and yet it is quite a well-known site, certainly in Mexico.
Yeah, and I'd heard of it quite a while ago, and I'd always had an inkling to go there, and it was just wonderful that it was on this itinerary. But it's larger and deeper than the Grand Canyon,
Hmm.
which really surprises a lot of people, and it certainly did me, because I have been to the Grand Canyon, and when you see it, it's hard to believe that anything's larger or deeper. But the train, El Chepe train, there's 86 tunnels along the track. There's 37 bridges. It's over 400 miles long, and it goes from a maximum altitude in Divisadero of almost 8,000 feet down to sea level, I believe, in Los Moches, which is on the Pacific coast. So the way I describe it is you've got these real sheer cliffs like Yosemite National Park, and then you've got the canyon like the Grand Canyon, and it's like a train ride in between the two.
Hmm.
So it's quite diverse, and the train itself was very nice. I wouldn't call it luxurious, but it was very comfortable and absolutely gorgeous the whole way. And knowing which side of the train to sit on can really help. But what was great about the fact that we were there in August is that there were very few people on the train, and so we weren't fighting for open window space to actually shoot, because we also had a videographer with us. So he was shooting video. So he and I were kind of blocking space for each other and switching back and forth from either side of the train and kind of helping each other, working as a team.
And how long is the train ride?
It's about 400 miles in total length.
Hmm.
That's from Chihuahua City to Los Mochis. We took it from Divisadero, which is quite a ways from Chihuahua City, down to a town called El Fuerte. So I'd say we did about 60% of the train ride, and it's known as the most beautiful part of the ride.
Okay.
Now, one thing we did that would be a nice tip for your guests is that in Divisadero, we were supposed to take the train from Creel through Divisadero, and there's a 15 or 20-minute stop in Divisadero. You get off the train, you're supposed to run down to the edge of the canyon, take some quick pictures, and then get back on the train in time for it to leave 20 minutes later. And what we did, that was in our original itinerary, and when we saw that, we said, now we need to stay there. We need to stay overnight, because I wanted to get it in the morning, in the afternoon, and there was all kinds of weather conditions coming through. So we ended up getting there, I don't know, about noon one day and leaving at noon the next day. So we had a full 24 hours. And the hotel that we stayed at, and I cannot think of the name of it. I was looking through our itinerary. We had the luxury of a tour coordinator who set up hotels and everything for us, which was great. So I don't remember the name of the hotel, but it was right on the edge of the canyon. And I've got a blog post on my blog that is called Same Scene, Different Time of Day. And you'll see that my room is right on the edge of the canyon. And so I took pictures over that 24-hour period or so of the storms coming through, no clouds, with clouds, rainbows. I mean, it was so diverse in that short period of time that it really made for some wonderful photography.
Interesting. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes so other people can see what we're talking about.
Oh, great.
Excellent.
So my suggestion is, when you're in a place for a period of time, and you can read about this in the post, is try to shoot the place as much as possible over that period of time, so that you can show it in a lot of different types of conditions, with people, without people, with clouds, without, at night, during the morning, daytime. So you get a really nice sort of portfolio of images of the same scene, but at different times of day. And you can also expand that into different times of year, seasons, things like that.
Excellent. And where did you go from there?
We started the train in Divisadero, and it was about a 6-hour ride down to El Fuerte. And you're going through these 3,000-foot cliffs, these wonderful valleys. There's a river down at the bottom. There's great bridges that you're crossing. But you have to be careful about the high contrast, because you've got the cliffs that are very much in shadow. And then you might also have in your scene a very bright scene with the sun shining through. So I suggest that you shoot in like a matrix metering mode, where the camera's taking into account the whole scene as far as its exposure goes, as opposed to a spot metering. Because otherwise, if you're spot metering on those shadows, the camera's going to want to bring out the exposure in those shadows, but it's going to blow out all the highlights, or vice versa. You're shooting into the highlights, it's going to want to knock down the exposure, and your shadows will all go black.
And my apologies to those people who are travelers but not photographers, but when you bring a photographer on, you're going to talk about photography. So
Absolutely. That's my job, is to help people get better pictures of their travels.
And we didn't talk about the other two times that Ralph has been on the show, but if you're interested, Ralph has been on talking about Montenegro, and then another time where we just talked about travel photography and some of the other tips that Ralph had in mind. Excellent. So anything else that surprised you about the canyon itself? I mean, that is really probably one of the better known attractions there in Chihuahua.
Yes, absolutely. And the canyon itself, there's a wonderful people, an indigenous people, the Tarahumaras. And they're known as the running people because they're known for their running capabilities. And they're the largest tribe of indigenous people in the state. There's about 50 to 70,000 population. They make these wonderful crafts that they sell, these lovely baskets and hand-woven textiles. And they sell them to people that come through, the tourists. And so our guides took us into these sort of remote areas where the Tarahumara lived, and they live in these sort of caves or cliff overhangs, and they've sort of made houses out of them.
So to this day, they still live in that environment?
Yes, yes, they do. Yeah. And there was one area that we went to where, and I'll provide you some pictures if you like, that, from what we understood from our guides, is that the governor of Chihuahua had seen the conditions that these people were living in. He immediately had some housing built just several feet away from where they were living.
And they didn't want to live in it.
They didn't want to move. They preferred to live where they were in these conditions. Really incredible.
I saw that coming.
Yeah, exactly. But they're not really outgoing people. They're very, very shy. But they sell their crafts. They are very entrepreneurial people. They're not too bad about getting their pictures taken, but they are very shy.
Any particular types of crafts that they are known for?
Yeah, they make these wonderful baskets of all sizes, from really tiny to big, big baskets that you could put huge plants in. Also textiles, and they dress in these wonderfully colored clothes. When I was there, the people really reminded me, for some reason, of the Peruvians or the South American, that sort of Indian look to them. But I asked the question, and I guess there's no relation there, but very dark skin. And what happened is that they retreated to the highland mountains and deep into the valleys upon the arrival of the Spanish in the 1600s.
So this is basically the people whose ancestors built the ruins at Pequimé.
I'm not sure that it was the Tarahumara, because that was quite a way away. That was quite a ways away. Yeah, and the Tarahumara were known for this particular region along the Copper Canyon.
Okay.
So I don't think it was their descendants or ancestors that had built Paquimé.
Okay.
But they retreated deep into the canyons and up into the mountains, so they avoided a lot of contact with the Spanish and weren't taken over by them or their culture taken away by the Spanish. And so they like to keep things arm's length, but friendly people, but not super outgoing, very shy. But I really enjoyed meeting them and seeing how they live. Really nice people.
Interesting. Okay. Any other surprises there in the Copper Canyon area?
The town of Creel itself, where we stayed for a couple nights, this couple that took us around, they own a tour company there, and they own the lodge there. It's called the Lodge at Creel. It's actually a Best Western hotel, but a really wonderful place to stay. But this is kind of I'm going to say it's sort of the Boulder, Colorado of the area. It's the stepping off point for a lot of trips to waterfalls and hiking and down to the Copper Canyon. There's a town called Batopilas, which is down in the canyon, about a 5 or 6 hour drive. We did not have time to do that, although that's something I would like to do on my next trip. And that's actually get down into the canyon, which is supposed to be absolutely amazing. So if people have time, I would highly recommend they explore that.
Okay.
But the weather, I'll tell you about the weather. Really, I mentioned that it was about 110 in Chihuahua City, and it was probably in the 40s, rainy and chilly up in the mountains in Creel, because, as I said, we're about 8,000 feet up at the highest point.
Right.
So there's quite a diversity of weather there as well. So that surprised me.
Okay, so it's something like going to the Grand Canyon. I know I've been there in a day that it was snowing at the top and 80 degrees at the bottom. So we're talking about that kind of difference in temperature. Interesting.
Absolutely, yep.
Of the whole experience there in Chihuahua, what was the best day? What really stands out for you?
I'll tell you, the best day was probably on arrival in Divisadero. This couple, Christina and Federico, drove us about 45 minutes from Creel to Divisadero, where we were going to start our train journey, and we were going to meet our videographer who was flying in from Australia, and then we were going to start our journey on the train. We stayed overnight there at this hotel that I said was right on the canyon's edge. And it was funny because we had to take a van. The van at the hotel lobby there at the entrance drove us up the switchback as far as he could, and then we had to drag our stuff probably up another 300 meters of sidewalk, and I mean, it was uphill because the van couldn't even get there. So we had to drag all our stuff up. Yeah. Then when we got to the room, though, the view just blew you away. It was the most amazing view from a hotel room I've ever had. And you'll see all those pictures on that blog post.
And this is Ralph's continued advertisement for Packing Light.
Absolutely. For sure. I felt sorry for the videographer because he had so much gear because he had to.
Right, sure.
Yeah, and we tried to help each other as much as possible. But as you can imagine, me and the writer were together for 35 days, and we had never met each other until I met him at LAX airport to fly down to Mexico City. But we had just a wonderful time, and we got along fantastically. And it could have gone the other way, I suppose.
Now, one thing I'm curious about, because we already said that the context of this whole trip, this 35-day trip to Mexico, was food. And I know that when you go to Mexico City, you get the tacos al pastor, and when you go down to Oaxaca, you try out the mole. I have no idea what you get in Chihuahua.
Yeah, Chihuahua, that northern part of Mexico, is known for burritos.
Oh, okay.
And what really surprised me is that I always thought burritos were an Americanization of Mexican food.
Uh-huh.
I don't know about you, but I'd always heard that they don't have burritos in Mexico.
Oh, I've had them in Tijuana, and they're
Yeah.
different from the burritos you get at Taco Bell, obviously, but they're also different from most of the burritos you get in the U.S. But I did not know that Chihuahua was a central burrito point there.
Yeah, so we had burritos there. There's a lot of other types of plates that are sort of distinct to that area. I can't name them all, though.
Well, what is a Chihuahua burrito like? How similar or dissimilar is it? Flour tortillas, corn tortillas?
Yeah, northern Mexico is known more for its flour tortillas,
Okay.
and southern Mexico for its corn. I'm talking very much in generalizations. They would put beans in the burritos, different types of meats. They would often grill them on a flat grill or griddle that they would have.
Okay.
In Divisadero, as I mentioned, the train only stopped for 20 minutes. So there's all these women set up there to feed the people that come off the train in that 20 minutes. And so they've got wonderful types of really quick, fast food that they're making there right on the grills.
And your favorite that you had was what?
Oh, I love Flor de Calabaza, which is the zucchini flowers.
Oh, interesting.
And
Okay.
yeah, with the local cheese on a blue tortilla.
So a blue corn tortilla.
Right, blue corn
Interesting.
tortilla, melted on the grill. Absolutely fabulous. That was my favorite with some local salsa.
I'm glad that we did this interview after I had dinner. And I normally ask people, what's the picture that best brings back the trip? You took a lot of pictures. I'm guessing thousands and thousands of pictures. Of the 7 days you spent in Chihuahua, what one picture is your favorite?
You might expect me to say something in the Copper Canyon, and I was very happy with the images I got there and the photo opportunities that we had. But what really struck me was that drive from Chihuahua City up to Casas Grandes and that valley, because these wonderful rainstorms and thunderstorms would go through and we could see them in the distance. And there's this green grass. It was neon green, almost a fake green. And I just so distinctly remember that. And these wonderful valleys, there's a lot of apple orchards up there. There's even ostrich farms and beef, a lot of cattle up there, cattle farms. And so you'd see these wonderful landscapes with mountains in the distance, these big puffy clouds, maybe a storm out in the distance with some lightning, a rainbow, and this neon green field. So that was very distinctive to me and probably the highlight of the trip and really the most unexpected, because I had an idea of what to expect with the Copper Canyon, but this area I had no expectations whatsoever and was very pleasantly surprised.
You mentioned Copper Canyon, and you're mentioning the green. As we talk about Copper Canyon, my understanding too is that it's not named from the mineral copper being mined there so much as from the color.
That's right. It's more about the color of the rock there than that there was actually copper mining, exactly.
So both the copper color as well as the greenish, and copper also turning green. So it's those combinations of colors that gives the canyon its name, is my understanding. And actually it was silver that was mined there.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Interesting. Okay. Did you get a chance? I don't know if you were working with guidebooks. I don't know if they recommended anything that you found was a waste of time while you were down there.
Well, as I said, we had a tour coordinator who pretty much handled all the logistics, the hotels, the transportation, things like that. We had guides when we got to a place, so they took us where they wanted to, although we had some fairly good say-so. As I mentioned, we changed the whole trip to be able to stay overnight in Divisadero instead of for 20 minutes, which would have been a travesty. And I would highly recommend that to anyone, is because I think you can stop 2 or 3 times along the route and stay overnight.
As part of the same ticket.
Exactly. You don't have to do it all in one swoop, so that I would highly recommend stopping in Divisadero and some of these other towns along the way. There's not much between Divisadero and El Fuerte where we stopped. I didn't have a guidebook for that area. We just had our own personal guides, which was pretty cool.
You mentioned some of the locals. Anyone who left the most impression on you?
Well, this couple that was our guides, we spent, I think, 3 whole days with them. They were absolutely fabulous. I couldn't highly recommend them enough if anyone was going down there. But the indigenous people, the Tarahumara, were very impressive. And I really enjoyed getting out and seeing how they lived. These wonderful bright colors, almost like you'd see in India, pinks and greens and blues. They make a lot of their own clothing. They were, as I mentioned, not very outgoing, but friendly and just very shy. Unlike other parts of Mexico where the people were very much against you taking pictures of them, and that was more down in like Chiapas.
Now, that sounds like quite a contrast. You mentioned the Mennonite community there that are known for more not being ostentatious. So you've got the bright colors in one place, and then I'm guessing fairly subdued colors in the other.
Oh, absolutely. They're very conservative. The woman that we met with, she was probably 30, 35 years old. She dressed very much in a Western, just jeans and a shirt. But you also found some of the women with these homemade dresses, bonnets, looking almost like the Amish in a way.
And they're fairly closely related. Up in North America, you'd have the Amish and the buggy, and then you'd have their next-door neighbors would be the black bumper Mennonites, who would paint over the chrome on the bumper of a car. So they'd still drive cars, but they'd paint over the bumper with black paint so that it wouldn't be ostentatious.
Is that right? I never heard that.
Now, Ralph, you're a fluent Spanish speaker, so you definitely have that advantage. How about someone like me who is not necessarily conversant in Spanish? Any tips for getting by?
A lot of the people, especially in the tourist industry, spoke English, so I don't think you have a problem at all. Very outgoing, as long as you try, just like a lot of places, as much as you can try to use your Spanish, they appreciate that, and they'll try to speak English to you as much as possible, and you'll always get by.
Okay. And then we can't really cover Mexico without raising at least the question of safety. We've already said that Ciudad Juarez, which is the very northern part of the state, has been a very unsafe place to be, especially as a drug dealer. Recently, you personally have had some safety experiences in Mexico, although a number of years ago. Ralph was actually kidnapped in Mexico City back during your college years.
Yeah, I mean, I was almost kidnapped. Yeah, it's a long story, but I was taken, and it could have been a lot worse. I wasn't taken for any long period of time overnight or anything, but yeah, I was manhandled by 4 men and with a gun, and they took me to my ATM and made me clear it out of all the money, and came back to my apartment and stole anything of value there. So it was not a good experience. And I'll be honest, it was a bit trepidatious going down to Mexico on this trip, especially to Mexico City, because I hadn't been there since then, which was 1994. So I guess, 16, 17 years ago.
And we should say that in 94, that was happening a lot more than it happens even in Mexico City right now. But so your radar has to be out for how safe the situation is, given your personal experiences with Mexico. Clearly, you took the job, so you were willing to go try it again. What was your experience where you were in Chihuahua? My impression is we're talking about a relatively safe area of Mexico.
Absolutely. There was a very high military presence almost everywhere we went. We saw a lot of military policia on the backs of jackets and even Kevlar vests, things with machine guns. But never once did I feel unsafe or like I shouldn't be in an area. I was extremely impressed because I had a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth from that experience in '94.
Sure.
And so I went back and I was very impressed with the changes that I saw in Mexico.
Well, you're also going to be a little less clueless than the rest of us because you can talk to the locals and find out what's going on more than a lot of us can.
Yeah, and it was even down to the roads seemed to be better. The pollution was less in Mexico City. The traffic didn't seem as bad. Even the bathrooms and the roadside restaurants all had toilet paper and hand towels and soap, which you always had to bring your own to those kinds of places.
Having just been in China, I can appreciate that.
Absolutely. So I saw some really great changes in Mexico, and I can't speak about it highly enough.
Excellent. And saw a lot of Mexico on this trip. How many stops did you make total in the 35 days?
I have a list, but I'm thinking that it was probably 13 stops in 35 days. I think we went to 10 or 11 UNESCO World Heritage sites. I think we took 11 or 12 flights and countless trains, planes, and automobiles, and one motorcycle. But yeah, it was a great diversity all over the country, from the Veracruz on the Gulf Coast up to La Paz, down to Chiapas, over to Merida, which I know you were in maybe a week or two before I was there.
I loved it.
Yeah, swimming in cenotes, and just trying the most wonderful food with world-famous chefs. It was really fabulous. And being able to get into a lot of these sites like Monte Alban, not Teotihuacan, I got there, it was very crowded. But getting down to Yaxchilan and the howler monkeys, that might be another post that people would be interested in. Having just returned maybe a month ago, my most recent blog posts are about Mexico. So if people have an interest, they can check those out and see. And as you said, I'm always talking about photography because my goal is to help people to get better pictures of their travels. So I try to put in a little bit of history, a little bit of the background, the experience that I was having, but maybe with a photography spin on it, and use some of the images that I took as examples for maybe how to help people improve their photography.
Excellent. As we go to wind this down, anything else that people should know about Chihuahua?
Don't believe everything you hear, especially about the drug wars and things like that. I never saw anything that made me at all wary. And don't be afraid to travel to Mexico in August like I was when I was looking at those weather reports. It, to me, is probably the best time to go. It can be a little bit warm. It does rain, but for photography, it's wonderful. Because it rains so much, the fields and the canyon are a wonderful green from the vegetation. So to me, it was probably one of the best times to go to Mexico.
Excellent.
Less crowds, you know.
Any money-saving tips for us, especially about Chihuahua?
Eat the street food. It's very inexpensive. It's very good. I had no problems with the safety of it. So I would highly recommend eating on the street there, just being cautious and careful and have common sense about what you see. But if they're making it right in front of you, maybe ask them to cook it a little bit longer if you don't like things on the rare side. But yeah, money-saving tip would definitely be eat on the street because it can be very inexpensive.
Yeah, well, we had that experience recently, and I think our best meal in the Yucatan when we were down there was in Merida, and it was just one of the little taco stands there in the Central Plaza, and I think we ate for $2 or $3 a person and had great food, and of course it was grilled food too, so it was being cooked, and that's obviously going to make things safer than doing something with fruits and vegetables, or obviously be a little more cautious about that, especially if you can't peel it.
Right, for sure.
Excellent. And finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Chihuahua when what?
When you walk just a few feet out of your hotel room and you look out at this amazing canyon, and you know that it's the Copper Canyon there in Chihuahua.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Chihuahua in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I would have to say variety
Okay.
and the variety of landscapes. So from plains and the desert valleys to the Copper Canyon itself, and diversity. And in that sense, I mean the people.
Mm-hmm.
So from the Mennonites
Mm-hmm.
to the other indigenous people, the Tarahumara and the local Mexicans, and unexpected.
Interesting.
So not having any expectations and really surprising.
Okay. And before we tell people where they can read more about you, I should mention to people who have joined the show relatively recently, Ralph and I actually did a joint photography tour to Egypt last year. So, Ralph, you'll find on his site some ways that you can go on photography tours with him, and I can personally recommend that. Although, as he said, he will get you up early. Ralph, where can people read more about your photography tours as well as your travels?
Sure, I'm trying to consolidate all of my 6 or 7 websites that I used to have into my blog at ralphvelasco.com. And there you can find out about my iPhone app that I have called My Shot List for Travel. I've got a book, 101 Tips for Developing Your Photographic Eye and more. I've got a lot of tours coming up next year. I've got an Eastern European Danube River cruise from Budapest to Vienna, and a lot of local tours that I do, Joshua Tree National Park, Death Valley. I'm here in Southern California, so I do a lot of tours right here. I'm from Chicago originally, so I love bringing people back to Chicago and to show off my hometown, and they absolutely love it. But if you go to ralphvelasco.com, you can find information about all those things and some good travel and photography tips, I hope.
Well, Ralph, thanks for coming back on the show and telling us some more about Mexico and especially about Chihuahua, which I almost managed the whole time to say without giggling. At least I'm hoping it will turn out that way after the show has been edited.
Oh, my pleasure, Chris. It's wonderful. People, please travel to Chihuahua.
In news of the community, I do again want to welcome all of those who've discovered the show through iTunes, which has been featuring this show, and remind you that this show is an enhanced show and does have pictures that you can see both in iTunes and on your iPod or iPhone. And with Ralph's pictures this week, this is a good episode to remind everyone of this version. If your calendar says October, it's not too late to vote for the Amateur Traveler for the Podcast Awards at podcastawards.com. I'm moderating a panel discussion next week at Blog World Los Angeles. If you happen to be there, let me know. I heard from Sarah L. this week, who commented on the Quebec episode 300, and said congratulations on another great episode and on 300 total episodes. It's clear that you put lots of time into researching guests and locations. As a native of New England, I've driven up to QC several times. I was bummed that Montmorency Falls wasn't mentioned. It's a great spot. There are stairs up the side of the waterfall about 275 feet, which offers a great view. There's also a suspension bridge over the falls. For those who aren't able to do that many stairs, there's also a tram that goes up to the same level. On a clear day, you can see quite far over the St. Lawrence River, and it's only about 12 kilometers from Old Quebec. You might want to bring a raincoat, though. If you climb the stairs, you'll get wet. Another great place is the Basilica Saint Anne du Beaupré, which is 35 kilometers from Old Quebec up the St. Lawrence River. Aside from being a beautiful building, there are also magnificent stained glass windows. They say miracles take place there. When you walk in, there's a column of crutches that have been left there by people who don't need them anymore. One thing to watch out for in the city are the murals. They've been done by the city on the sides of buildings, and they are beautiful and show typical Quebec life. If you're there in the early spring, there will still be snow on the ground likely. Try and go to a sugar shack. We went and had a traditional Quebecois meal, ham, split pea soup, and pancakes with syrup, which is followed by singing in French and English. After the singing, everyone goes out into the night and enjoys hot maple syrup poured onto snow in troughs, which you roll onto a popsicle stick like a maple lollipop. It's great fun. The place we went also had sleds and stuff, so you could get in touch with your inner child and play in the snow. It's a great way to spend an evening. Thanks very much, Sarah. A few weeks back, I heard from Diane, and Diane had a bone to pick with me. Hello, Chris. I've recently discovered podcasts, and I have been enjoying yours in particular. First, I listened to all the ones relating to areas that interested me the most. I enjoyed the format so much, and am listening to your enthusiastic guests. I began to listen to the podcast of areas that held no interest, noticed the use of past tense to me, and found I enjoy them just as much. However, in listening to your Canary Islands podcast, number 294, I found I was becoming increasingly annoyed by your continual use of the word interesting, often spoken with a disinterested tone, giving a perceived impression that you were bored with the subject matter, your guest, or both. It spoiled the podcast for me because I found I was gritting my teeth only halfway through the podcast every time I heard you speak that word. I challenge you to listen to that podcast, and even if you disagree, just for kicks, count how many times you spoke the word. I would have, but I couldn't bring myself to listen again. Apparently, there's a new amateur traveler drinking game to see how often I say the word interesting. I found that email interesting. I do use that word quite a lot. I'm sorry if it appears that I either use it incorrectly, that when I am not interested. Often, unfortunately, I am recording the episodes late at night or early in the morning when I'm not disinterested, but just tired. Trying to do the podcast on top of a full-time job sometimes leaves me burning the candle at both ends. Also, for my full-time job, I'm living in the West Coast and working on East Coast time, so my sleep schedules are a little erratic these days. So I apologize if that made me seem disinterested. Gary's a friend and I am interested. I was interested in his trip, but I just probably was tired. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions or bones to pick with me, feel free to leave a comment at amateurtraveler.com or drop me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.